Hi, and welcome to our class on military culture and entering the war zone. I'm Dr. Jessica Strom. I'm your instructor for this class. My background is that I have a PhD in social work as well as a master's in social work and a bachelor's in social work. I did social work all the way through, but then I married a guy in the Army, and so now I'm a military spouse. So I decided to focus my research on military family members. So this lecture is the intro, talking about about military service members, veterans, and their families very broadly, and talking a little bit broadly about the ranks and the branches and some of the military culture. So let's get to it. So first, in North Carolina, there is a large active duty population, and usually where you find a large active duty population, you'll also find a lot of veterans, a large veteran population. So North Carolina is no exception to that. There are two major military installations, one at Fort Bragg, which is the Army, or mostly the Army, and one at Camp Lejeune, or Camp Lejeune, however you pronounce it, and that is primarily Marines, although you'll also see Navy and Coast Guard and Air Force all over the place. So there's a bunch of smaller installations as well. So there is a lot of concentrated military families and service members in North Carolina. In fact, if you look at the geographic stationing of the active duty population, there are only 3 states that have more active duty service members than North Carolina. California has several, at San Diego and Monterey. Virginia, of course, has several large bases, as well as Quantico and Northern Virginia, the Pentagon. And Texas also has several very large bases. So North Carolina's up there. North Carolina is also number 8 in the total veteran population. Like I said, when you have a lot of service members, you tend to have a lot of veterans. Often families will settle where their last duty station is, often but not always, or they will settle in a place where they were at a previous duty station. So North Carolina has a lot of veterans as well. Wilmington in particular has about 8% veterans in their population, which is much higher than the national average. About 1,700 veterans in North Carolina, in that zip code in Wilmington alone. So let's talk a little bit about basic military structure. Now, for many of you, this is going to be very basic and very review, but I feel like it's important to get a foundation of this before we get started into what culture is, because the structure drives some of the culture. So there are now 6 branches of the military. There were 5 for a long time, and we just added a new one. We have, of course, the Air Force, the Army, the Coast Guard, which is a sort of a special circumstance. I'll get to that. We have the Marine Corps, the Navy, and our newest member is the Space Force. Now, those are the branches of the military. There are also different components of the military, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as well. We have active duty, and then we have reserves, and then we have National Guard. And often reserves and National Guard are grouped together to be called sort of the reserve component, because the structure of their military service often looks very different from active duty service members. Now, we talk about military culture as a whole, but it's really not a monolithic thing. There are differences not only by branch, but also by component, by the job that you have, by different subgroups. All kinds of different things, different missions contribute to different aspects of military culture. But I'm going to talk about it broadly, recognize that there is diversity within the structure of the military as well. So the first one that I want to talk about, and it's not just because I'm an Army spouse, but it's because it is the biggest branch, is the Army. This is what people often think of when they think of military service members. They think of soldiers. So Army has an active duty component. We have about 500,000 active duty service members. And now that fluctuates depending on the year and the needs of the military. But active duty is the largest component. There is also two other components. There's the Army National Guard, and then there are the Army Reserves. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between National Guard and Reserves in a little bit. Army is essentially responsible for land-based operations, and service members in the Army are called soldiers. Next, we have the Navy. The Navy is going to be sea-based operations, obviously, They are responsible also for naval aircraft, so they do have some planes as well and some pilots. They also have an active duty and a reserve. There is not a Navy National Guard, though. The Navy provides medical personnel for the Marine Corps. There's a special relationship between the Navy and the Marine Corps. The medical personnel for the Marine Corps are part of the Navy. They're sailors, but they're called corpsmen. You do not pronounce the P in corps, just so you know. Next is the Marine Corps. Many of you are probably familiar with this branch as you are here in Wilmington or in Jacksonville. The Marine Corps, I was going to say it was the smallest branch. It was the smallest branch until we started with the Space Force. So it was the smallest group. It was sort of a subsidiary of the Navy, but it is its own branch. They have a special relationship there. They have an active duty component as well as a reserve component. Again, no National Guard for Marines. They're responsible for amphibious operations, meaning land operations that support naval campaigns as well as naval landings, amphibious landings. They also have other duties as directed by the president. So they can do a lot of different things, and they are called Marines. The Air Force. The Air Force, it also has an active duty component as well as an Air National Guard and Air Force Reserves. They are, as you might expect, responsible for air operations, so they do a lot of the planes and pilots and flying. They are called airmen. We have the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is a little bit different because they used to be under the Department of Transportation because they were responsible for protecting U.S. interests in maritime regions around the coast. This could be international waters, coasts, ports, inland waterways, anything with water around it, the Coast Guard can be responsible for. So it was under the Department of Transportation, but since 9/11/2001 was under the Department of Homeland Security. So they also have an active duty as well as a reserve, and you'll find them, like I said, all over the coast. Michigan, Florida, California, all along the east and west coast. Now, they are formally called guardsmen, but informally they are often called coasties. And our newest baby little branch is the Space Force. This was established in December of 2019, so it is brand new. It exists within the Air Force, so people are transferring laterally between the Air Force and the Space Force. They are called Guardians, and their brand new mission is to protect U.S. and allied interests in space and provide space capabilities to the Joint Force. So that is still evolving, but that is our newest branch of the military. Now, military structure. A little bit about the difference between active and reserve. Active, they work full-time for the military. They are on call all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They are the permanent military force. Now, the structure of their work week varies considerably. So for some, it can be a 40-hour work week. For others, it's going to be more than that, maybe less than that. It varies considerably depending on the job that they're doing, the mission that they're doing, whether they're deployed or not deployed, whether they are in a medical field or a non-medical field. It varies considerably. Now, the reserve component, they are generally more part-time duties. You've heard the phrase that it's 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. It can look like that. They can also be activated to augment the active component. So you can be an activated reserve or activated National Guard. And often those look a lot more like active duty than they look like reserve, meaning they relocate and transfer from place to place. They are working full-time at their military job. But the reserve components often have some special circumstances that impact their experience in military life, in that they're often straddling civilian job as well as a military job, and it can be difficult to balance those two things. Sometimes the civilian job, they have to leave their civilian job or leave a business that they started or leave school in order to manage their military duties and military responsibilities. And sometimes it's not as easy to transition back and forth from one to the other, both psychologically as well as financially and getting and organizationally. So those are some special challenges for National Guard and Reserve component service members. So I talked a little bit about this already. I got ahead of myself. The active service has active duty, activated reserve, active reserve, activated reserve, and then there's individual ready reserve who have been trained, could be called up, but don't have a regular responsibility or obligation. Then there's veterans. Veterans are those who are separated from service. There's actually some debate about what constitutes a veteran and what does not. There are strict definitions depending on who you ask. The VA has one definition. Other organizations have other definitions. Then there's the status of being a combat veteran. Again, the VA has one definition of what combat veteran means. Other people have other definitions of what combat veteran means. But what I tend to default to is having it be self-defined. So I am not going to tell you that you are or are not a veteran, or that you are or are not a combat veteran, because your perception colors how you perceive things. Your perception colors how you behave. So I'm more interested in your subjective perception than I am in the objective truth. So a little bit about the difference between reserve component and National Guard. Reserves are controlled by the federal government. So they're a federal thing. They're activated by presidential order. They are entirely federal. National Guard, although it seems you think national means federal, no, National Guard are controlled by the states, actually. They can be activated by state governors during natural disasters or civil unrest or other emergencies. In 2020, they were activated at an unprecedented rate. Almost half of National Guard service members were activated because of civil unrest, because of other emergencies, national disasters, COVID-19, all of these things happening at one time resulted in a number of activations. So they can also be activated into service during times of need by presidential order in order to supplement the active component. So you'll see National Guardsmen who were deployed to a combat zone because they were activated by a presidential order to supplement the active component. So, some characteristics that are typical of military life. What is typical is that it is atypical. It is unpredictable. There are long, unpredictable work hours. There is often a lot of separation from family, whether that is deployment. People often think of deployment, but it's not just that. It's also when you're away for training, or you're in the field for a field problem, or you have a permanent change of station or a PCS, or you are TDY, you have temporary duty somewhere for a short period of time. There are lots of little separations as well as the longer separations from family. You're also often in a harsh or lethal environment where there's often considerable, frequent personal threats or the witnessing or experiencing of loss of life or limb. Other stressors, particularly as we're coming off of a long conflict in Afghanistan, is the number and length of deployments. Now, as we talk a little bit more about war cohorts and veterans from different eras, you'll see how the number and length of deployments is characteristic of an era of service member. So for service post 9/11 service members, veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, they often have multiple deployments that could be long or often a number of deployments that are shorter. But in Vietnam, it was often a one-year deployment. So there's lots of stressors that go with the military lifestyle. There's also to consider their service members' experiences don't start the minute they enter the military. They bring with them all of their life experiences prior to their joining of the military and prior to deployment. So often if they've had an adverse childhood experience, ACE, they bring that with them. They bring any trauma they've previously experienced with them to military service and to deployment. And that also impacts how they perceive things and how they respond and behave to things.